I'm curious how many of you were present at the economic crisis town hall 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago. Because that really is the origin of the Oregon State Bank campaign. We came together, there were some 800 of us who came together January 31st, 2009. So it was right in the early stages of the meltdown on Wall Street. And we spent a lot of time in the morning there talking about how that meltdown had happened, about the deregulation of the financial services industry, about the coziness of the investment banks with the federal government, about the failures of the Federal Reserve, and to say nothing about the SEC and the rest of the regulators, about the free trade agenda, which through its financial services agreement virtually mandates further deregulation of financial services globally. We talked about incredibly risky investing that had been going on Wall Street, about the leveraging at 40 to 1 when it should have been down by 10 to 1. We talked about the now very infamous credit default swaps, and we looked at what was starting then, just starting, to happen to Main Street as a result of this kind of behavior on Wall Street. That was the morning. Then in the afternoon, we started to talk about what we could do about it. And that was the part that I found really extraordinary and a tribute, I think, to Jobs with Justice and the other organizations that came together to put that day together for us so that we would not leave feeling disempowered. We started talking about our economy as though it was something we could have some control over. And simply through that conversation, we began to take control. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about supporting local businesses. We talked about supporting local farmers. We talked about farmers markets. We talked about co-ops. We talked about building more locally based enterprises. All of those things that we thought we could do so that we could begin to build something solid here in Oregon that wouldn't be so much at the mercy of Wall Street's vagaries. And we launched one of the first Move Your Money campaigns in the entire country, which we called in true Portland fashion, Fire Your Bank. We encouraged people to move their money to local banks, to take it out of the big banks, the too big to fail banks, and into locally owned banks and credit unions. We also started a process at that point of talking to community bankers and credit unions, to farmers and to small business owners, and we've continued that for 2 years now. And in the course of doing that, we were trying to figure out what it was that made what happened on Wall Street so very devastating to us here 3,000 miles away. And a big piece of that was that credit simply was not moving. Because the Wall Street banks had imploded, there was no longer any way for the smaller, more local banks to actually get the participation loans and the funding that they needed to keep credit flowing to local businesses. People here in Oregon were losing their jobs and losing their homes because Wall Street had gorged itself. So we began to turn our attention to the question of banks. Why weren't they lending? Why were so many of them closing? And yes, it's true that some of them had been making unwise loans, just as many homeowners had taken on silly mortgage deals that they never should have gotten involved in. But most of them were simply caught in the crunch through no fault of their own. And the question began to evolve, could the state help? Because the state of Oregon, as small a state as it is, has in its coffers some 60, it used to be $80 billion. And the question is, what was happening with that money? Well, of course, what was happening with that money was it was being invested in Wall Street banks, in private equity funds, in hedge funds. It was being invested in Wall Street, and through Wall Street, it was being invested globally. Very few of those dollars were being put to work here in Oregon. And probably very few of them were being put to work in the United States. So the question came to us, what if some of those dollars, not the trust funds, not PERS, but just the more liquid assets of the state, could be put to use by partnering with community banks and credit unions, could be put to use to start providing lines of credit again to qualified borrowers, to small businesses and farmers who had viable business plans, to get them moving again so that they could start hiring again, so that people could start working again, so people could start moving their own economy forward. So we looked at the model of the Bank of North Dakota, which was started in 1919 in a very similar economic and historical period. The Bank of North Dakota remains today very viable and very popular. And North Dakota, in case you don't know, is a very Republican state. They love their state bank. It does not compete, nor would ours compete with credit unions or community banks. Rather, it would partner with them. It would lead to a much healthier local banking sector than most states have, than we have right now. It would serve as a banker's bank and not a retail bank. It would help to prevent bank consolidation. As we lose our small community banks around the state, the bigger banks are gobbling them up. And we're seeing more and more and more consolidation. The underlying question in this campaign is, do we want a healthy, diverse, robust local banking system? And to me, the answer is obvious, yes. If we don't have a local banking system, we do not have the tools to have a truly local economy. It's different from just a state lending program in that the bank, would fund economic development programs through revenues it generates itself from more market-driven lending. In other words, this is a revenue center. This is not something which costs the state money. This is something which, in the long run, not tomorrow, not immediately, will start to make money for the state and actually put money back into either the general fund or the rainy day fund, rather than costing us. It saves the bank, it could save, if it's structured properly, it could save the bank millions of dollars in banking fees as well. In other words, this is a big idea. This is a very important change that we could do to get a grip on our own economy. It bridges party divides. It bridges the rural-urban divide in this state. It is every bit as important for small towns in rural Oregon, for farmers in rural Oregon, as it is for small businesses here in Portland or in Eugene or in Salem. And it also bridges this divide that we're seeing growing now between public sector and private sector unions. Because it doesn't pit one against the other looking at a constantly shrinking whole. Instead, it says, let's get a grip on our own economy and build something for the future that is ours in Oregon, that we can have control over whether or not Wall Street manages to survive. And some of us could hope it doesn't. We have received very positive support in the legislature for this idea. We've received support from both parties, and in fact, during the election season, the nomination season, the Working Families Party made this one of our top priorities and got commitments at that time from 30 candidates who are now translated into 24 members of the current legislature who were already committed to supporting a state bank because they had received the Working Families Party nomination. One of those, a Republican from Pendleton, Bob Jensen, has now introduced a state bank bill. It's HB 2972. That's an excellent bill. And the fact that it comes from rural Oregon says a lot about what this will do for us in the future.